The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for Russia to be expelled from the United Nations Security Council, an enticing thought, but of course it will never happen. Zelensky's made this impassioned plea in a video to the UN Security Council. I'll show you this reporting of the latest from Ukraine right now, but a warning first that there are some distressing images involved.
In an institution born out of the horrors of World War II, a chamber created to prevent repeats of history, the world's top diplomats, Russia among them, gathered to hear Ukraine's president allege an ongoing genocide.
The civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, just for their pleasure. They cut off limbs, cut their throats, slashed their throats. Women were raped and killed in front of their children.
It was the weekend images emerging from Bucha which prompted this meeting of the Security Council. They'd invited Volodymyr Zelensky to join them, but were not prepared for what he would show them. What they saw in the chamber cannot be broadcast here, but the images of dead bodies are horrific. They're from several towns across Ukraine, some of them charred, hands tied behind backs, women and children among them. We cannot yet independently verify the context behind them, but the pattern is clear: killings, mass executions, rapes.
Just shocking stuff. To find out what we ought to be doing next, I want to bring in former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, who joins me live from the Sydney CBD. Thanks for joining us, Tony. You've said that we need to do more to help Ukraine. When I say we, not just Australia, but of course the Western world. To what extent are the Ukrainians fighting our fight?
Chris, the big global challenge right now, it's not the pandemic, it's certainly not climate change, it is the march of the dictatorships. It's the Moscow-Beijing axis, which we have seen horrifically at work on our screens in Ukraine, including the massacre of hundreds of innocent people in absolute cold blood. This is the big challenge. The Ukrainians are not just fighting for their own freedom, they're fighting for everyone's freedom, because there is no doubt, Putin has told us as much, that he wants to recreate Greater Russia, and that means once he's subjugated Ukraine, Poland and the Baltic states are next. And if he gets away with the overlordship of Eastern Europe, obviously China will be on the march, starting with Taiwan. And that means a colder, darker, poorer world for everyone, including for us here in Australia. So this is absolutely critical. I was very pleased when Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton almost immediately promised they met President Zelensky's request for Bushmaster armoured vehicles, but let's give the Ukrainians plenty of them. Let's provide at least 100. We've got about 1,000 sitting in stock, mostly up in Brisbane. Let's give them 1,000, and let's be ready to help NATO in Poland and in the Baltic states if they need help to militarily buttress NATO's vulnerable eastern flank.
I think you said 1,000 there. What you've been calling for is 100 of our 1,000. Peter Dutton has said that's probably too many. We're sending 4 at a time, but he hasn't announced a number yet. But that's one issue, one way we can help here. I just want to ask you, without at all saying we should do less to support Ukraine, when you say that Poland or Hungary would be next, is that really the case? Wouldn't Russia always stop at the Ukrainian border, because to engage with NATO countries would dramatically, of course, change the equation here?
Well, yes, it certainly would raise the stakes, but he has told us again and again, repeatedly and in public, that he believes that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Plainly, he wants to recreate Greater Russia. He sees himself as some kind of latter-day Peter the Great, and that's why it is absolutely critical, not only that we give Ukraine all the help we possibly can, and yes, 100 of our almost 1,000 Bushmasters, let's dispatch them post-haste. If needs be, let's drive them through Greece and Romania and give them to the Ukrainians at the border. And sure, if NATO wants help, we should be prepared to consider it.
What about the red line that's been drawn by the West? That is, we will not put any NATO troops into Ukraine. Should that be revisited? Is there a way NATO troops could help to buttress and protect a city like Kiev, or hold the line behind the front line of Ukrainian forces? Should that be something that NATO is willing to consider?
Well, let's see what further atrocities the Russian tyrant is responsible for. The footage from Ukraine right now is absolutely sickening. It's repellent, it's abhorrent, and yet these are atrocities which pretty clearly were carried out by Russian armed forces with their dictator's license. So if red lines could be drawn in Syria, if red lines could be drawn in former Yugoslavia, it's hard to see why red lines shouldn't be drawn in Ukraine as well.
Well, I just want to go on to some other issues, and starting with one, again, related to Australia's foreign policy settings, and that is the striking of the free trade deal with India. Just how important is this, obviously, as a trading alternative to the might of China, but also in terms of underpinning our growing strategic links with India, especially through the Quad?
Yeah, this is essentially an important economic complement to the strategic dimensions of the Quad. It's very, very significant, not just for Australia, but ultimately for the wider world. It's the first recent deal, comprehensive deal, that India has done with a major developed economy in quite some time. It's the best deal that India has done with a major developed economy, and it's a sign of India's increasing willingness to engage with the West rather than maintaining its traditional non-aligned status. Now, obviously, this is a function of the changing geopolitics, but I hope now that all of those Australian businesses that had China in their critical supply chains will look to India to replace China, because India is a democracy under the rule of law. It was always a much more natural and obvious partner for Australia and our allies than China. So let's make the most of this. Every significant Australian business with a global footprint now needs to have an India strategy.
Well, the election is only days away from being called. I could hardly let you go without chucking in a couple of domestic political questions. We interviewed at the top of the program the woman Catherine Deves, who's going to be the candidate for the Liberal Party in your old seat of Warringah. To what extent have these factional shenanigans and legal challenges and game playing in New South Wales delaying and mucking up pre-selections for months after months after months, so that you've only got candidates in winnable seats on the cusp of the election? To what extent has that cruelled Scott Morrison's chances of re-election?
Well, obviously it's hardly helped, but look, it's now a done deal, and I'm certainly going to do everything I can to help our candidates wherever they want me to win the seat, and I'm looking forward to being of assistance to Catherine Deves in my old seat, who I think is an excellent candidate who'll do a good job. I do want to make this point though, Chris. I'm not going to offer any observations at this point in time, given the fight ahead to win the election, about the internal machinations of the Liberal Party. But as soon as this election is over, we really do need to have a very tough conversation about delivering to the Liberal Party's members the democratic commitments that were made to them back in 2016 and 2017. Let's win this election. Let's fight the good fight, but then things have got to be sorted out and commitments have got to be honoured.
Well, just on that, the state executive member who's been running the legal challenge, Matt Kamanzulu, I'm told today that he's been expelled from the party. So that's hardly moving on and sorting these things out.
As I say, we're going to have a come to Jesus moment inside the New South Wales Liberal Party as soon as this election has been fought and hopefully won.
Tony Abbott, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris.
Former Prime Minister Tony Abbott there talking about the big global strategic issues, how important Ukraine is to us in the Western world, not just to the Ukrainian people. Also, they're talking about the New South Wales Liberal Party needing to have a come-to-Jesus moment after the election to sort itself out. A powerful intervention there.